as tribal people, we kind of have this ability to relate to the natural world. And so with the mathematics background, and it's not too much of a jump to understand the statistics and the statistical analysis around fish and wildlife management, and then the connection to Mother Earth and the resources that we all still rely on was the other important part. So at that point in time, I had had a lot of exposure to working in the natural world, building roads for logging, taking care of buildings and campgrounds and trails, all that stuff out in nature. A little bit of water, but not a lot of exposure to some water stuff. But when I walked through the door in 1992, we were 7 years into a newly negotiated FERC license, which I saw it happening when I was going to college. It was in the Charcusta News, which we still got, and I paid attention. Of course, Grandma always gave me an earful about it. But wasn't really sinking into me as what the tribes were up to. The other part was the fish and wildlife. In 1992, that was only 4 years into this state tribal fish and wildlife agreement. So those two things were really fresh, and take over of Mission Valley Power. So those three things were like, oh my gosh, the tribe's taking over the world.
Hooray!
Yeah. So as I walked through the door then and into that position, all of those things were taking place. Mission Valley Power was already in place, but right then in my lap comes the Fish and Wildlife Agreement. So 1988, and I think it had 4-year terms. So I believe that first year I came, we had to renew it. So there was some discernment over whether or not it was working on both this part of the state and the tribes, and came to the conclusion that, yeah, it's a good thing, and it's still in place today. And then the second thing that was a big deal was the license, in that we had co-licensee status, which I'll talk about in a moment as we talk about the details of takeover. But what we didn't have were 4E conditions, and 4E conditions are a shorthand for Section 4E of the Federal Power Act, which says that when a entity builds a hydroelectric facility on waters that impact a federal reservation, they're obligated to mitigate for the original intent of that reservation. And so for us, that meant looking at our treaty and saying, okay, the treaty's primary protection of resources for us to perpetuate our culture into the future is what the reservation was established for, and this facility impacts that. And prior to that, there were no 4E conditions. There wasn't any fish and wildlife mitigation. So I get handed the Kerr file. I always tell people when I walk through the door, it wasn't quite that fast, but it was not very much longer after that. And Rhonda was my boss, and she handed me this and said, Brian, we got to get this done. And I said, wow, okay, we'll get it figured out. And so waited into it. Shortly after that, the tribes hired an attorney that Dan was the managing attorney, and he brought in another attorney that really was an expert in FERC, and we had our own FERC attorneys. We started wrapping our heads around what it was going to take to get the mitigation measures and the 4E conditions in place, which had to be issued by the Secretary of Interior. Yeah, so who's FERC? So FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and it's a commission that exists in Washington, D.C., the members are appointed by presidents, ratified by Congress, and they sit on a commission to implement the Federal Power Act from two perspectives. Market and economics is one perspective, dam safety and dams is another perspective. Because dams were the first electricity generation in the country. And so that's where it got its roots. And the Federal Power Act was just passed at the time this facility was built, 1930s. Went through the establishment of the 4E conditions. So I was lead natural resource department person, along with the team of biologists, that fish and wildlife managers, attorneys, and we worked on the 4E conditions. First had to get them issued by the Department of Interior. That was quite an effort to get the Interior to hire experts to get 4E conditions established. A key piece of that was the establishment of lower river operational constraints. There were some mitigation agreements put in place as part of the 1985 negotiations. They were never approved by the Department of Interior. They had some approval for or contemplation for replacing lost habitat on reservation, but it was going to be the company, Montana Power Company, that was going to buy all that habitat and then manage it for Fish and Wildlife going forward. The Fish and Wildlife Service was going to get a whole big chunk of money and rebuild the Creston National Fish Hatchery so they could replace and put kokanee salmon into Flathead Lake, because they believed at the time that kokanee salmon planting in Flathead Lake was going to restore native species. Because the theory was that lake trout, which was taken over, was they needed something to eat besides the bull trout and the Westlow cutthroat. So keep it full of kokanee, which kokanee had blinked out. So those were kind of the big pieces. And then the tribe was going to get some money to do some mitigation work here on reservation, but it was the smaller pieces of the pie when you look at it. And there were no operational constraints on the dam. And at the time, the dam was being operated as a load following facility, which means that in electricity, you have to balance every second of every day load and supply. And so mostly it was hydropower on Montana Power Company system. And you might imagine that at the time, which is similar to today, electricity demand changes throughout the day. So right now it's pretty stable, fairly low, midday. As we all go home, and at that time, pre-COVID, we'd all go home, turn on the TV, kick on the oven, whatever, AC units, and demand goes way up. And then you also get a similar peak in the morning, and then at night it's really quiet. So you get this look to the electricity demand. And so to balance that, make all of the Montana Power Company load or supply match that load, then something has to move. One of the generators has to move. And they chose, and it was really designed to do this, for that generator to be this one, at that time, Kerr Dam. Balance the entire system. So when the original mitigation package was put together, Montana Power Company said that's off the table. So growing up on Low River, I said, well, I don't like that. So when I came to work for the tribe, I said, why are we settling for this? This has tremendous impacts. And I always remember I took the kids, we had two boys, my wife and I, and we floated from Buffalo Bridge to Sloan's Bridge. And right at the Nez Perce cabin, there's a great place to camp down there on the flat. And there was a beautiful little backwater in there. We pulled in at night, rode in there with our drift boat. About 3 feet of water, and they were swimming in there all night, evening, and we camped right beside it, right on the shore. Get up in the morning, and there's no water. Had to drag the dang drift boat 100 yards across the gravel. So I took pictures of them swimming, and I took pictures of that. And I would take it when I would go places and say, look, this is what we're trying to address, this problem right here. And then the next part that I advocated for was, why should Montana Power Company own the land? we should own the land. And at that same time, we were, as a tribe, really wrapping our heads around and embracing that, our previous tribal councils up to now have been doing a really good job of buying back the reservation. That needs to be really the basis of everything we do. So here's a great opportunity. There's 3,089 acres of lost habitat around Flathead Lake on our reservation that needs to be mitigated or made up for. And it's going to happen here on the reservation. And you don't get 1 for 1. It's more like 3 or 4 to 1. So that needs to be owned and managed by us as a tribe. So that was number 2, is that we'd be the owners. The money's going to come to us, and we're going to buy the land. Montana Power Company was actually okay with that, because when they looked at the requirements for making it happen in 5 years, they didn't think they could make it happen. So they were okay with that. And then the other one that was quite an interesting fight, though, was the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was really had strategically put themselves in a position to get a whole bunch of money to rebuild and expand the Creston National Fish Hatchery. And there were 2 things that happened right when I came back to work for the tribe. Number 1 was we were already planting some fish with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the state of Montana into Flathead Lake from Creston, kokanee salmon, using Bonneville Power Administration mitigation funds. And we have scientists that were working for us then, still working for us now, and I go in and talk to them, and they say, what's going on here? They're eating them all. The lake trout are eating them all faster than we can put them in. We would do the monitoring, pull the lake trout out, and we'd have a lake trout this big, and no kidding, I think the most they ever got out of one, they cut that sucker open, and there was like 23 baby kokanee salmon inside that lake trout. And I said, so we're feeding a lake trout? Yeah. I said, well, that's a waste of money. And so I said, we're not going down that path. I said, what would it take for us to say, no, we're going to promote bull trout and west slope cutthroat and not just promote more of what's there? He said, the existence of us as tribal people depend on the existence of the fish and wildlife that were put here by the Creator for us, and if they're not here, we lose a piece of us. So we need to switch to go after bull trout and west slope cutthroat. And so after visiting with our scientists and bringing in others, we said, you know what, supplementation of non-native fish isn't going to do that. It's just going to perpetuate more of what's going on. So I said, okay, what would be some good strategies? Well, replace some habitat. So again, habitat focused on reservation again, and suppress the lake trout. Because what happened with the whole Flathead Lake, it got changed over the course of time. First, the lake trout were brought in by rail from the Great Lakes, as well as lake whitefish. So Lake Superior whitefish, called Lake Superior whitefish because they come from Lake Superior. So both of those came by train, and then ultimately also mysis shrimp came from those same waters, because all of those fish thrived back there, and they thrived to a point where they were quite good commercial fishery. So they were brought in and put here in these waters to mimic what was happening in the Great Lakes for commercial fishing. And so you look at all that, and well, it was working. Originally, the mysis shrimp were put into Whitefish Lake, is sort of the biological history of them. Then they made their way down into Flathead. And then in the 80s, they flourished. The mysis shrimp did. So the lake whitefish and the lake trout were there for many decades. Bull trout and west slope cutthroat were still doing okay. So they were kind of coexisting. And when I was a kid, you probably remember, Julie, you could catch cutthroat, really nice ones, out of Flathead Lake, springtime especially. Phenomenal west slope cutthroat fishing. And when we'd go catch the salmon during spawning season, you could see bull trout swimming around out there with him. You throw a lure and you catch one of those too, all in Flathead Lake. And then by 1992, when I came back as a Fish and Wildlife Manager, it was tough to catch either of those species. And as our biologists started to study and look what was going on, the realization came that, wow, the mysis shrimp have just proliferated. And so what's happened then is you had the West Slope cutthroat and kokanee kind of coexisted because they depended upon the food source at the top of the lake. So planktons and insects and whatnot that were at the top of the lake. So they'd feed during the daylight hours and they'd go to bed at night. Well, mysis shrimp outcompeted them because they feed all night long and don't feed during the day. So mysis shrimp, boom, explodes, and it goes to the surface, eats all that stuff at night that those other species are depending on, takes all that nutrition and brings it to the bottom. And what's at the bottom are lake whitefish and lake trout. And they start feeding on the mysis shrimp. So that's why they work so well as a symbiotic group of species in other areas, and they worked well here. And so what that did, first of all, it drove the kokanee salmon to extinction in Flathead Lake. They're not there anymore. Continues to impact West Slope cutthroat, and then it creates an opportunity for the lake trout and the lake whitefish to outcompete the bull trout. We need to get on a trajectory that's going to take us back to where we have our native species. So that's kind of another story about agency right there. Is, and it wasn't an easy decision. People looked and the fisheries manager said, Brian, you realize there might be some time periods in there where we might not have very good fishing in the lake. And I said, well, I don't care if we don't have very good fishing for non-native species if we're heading someplace where we have good fishing for native species. The ones we depend on. So we made that decision. And so it was quite a battle with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service over those hatchery dollars because we were changing the mitigation. So we had a whole carte blanche kind of shift then of the mitigation. So the operations changed, ownership of habitat and acquisition of the habitat changed, and moving away from hatchery supplementation for in-lake mitigation changed.